Like that?
As you like, however you want to do it. You know?
Should I do it in Texan?
Yes.
Obviously, the answer to that is yes. Okay. Hold on. I gotta like channel my inner Texan. From the lab to your ears, this is WonderLab. Wait, crap. Is it plural?
Yeah.
Okay, one more time. God damn it. I'm
right,
terrible.
No, it's fine. Hey, this isn't live radio. All right, ready?
From the lab to your ears, you're listening to WonderLabs. Did you like that? Did the Texanness come through?
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson, checking in from typhoony Okinawa. A fun fact for you. Typhoons are actually the same thing as hurricanes and cyclones. They're all tropical storms, and the distinction between them is purely geographical. Typhoons are formed over the Northwest Pacific, cyclones over the South Pacific and Indian Ocean, and hurricanes over the North Atlantic and Northeast Pacific. So there you go. Not even through the intro, and you're already learning perfect facts for a pub quiz. And linguistics facts, no less, which is fitting for today's conversation. Today I'm joined by Professor Chris Davis, who braved a typhoon, well, more of a small storm, to reach the recording studio for this interview. And I'm glad that he made it, because this one's an opus. Professor Davis is a professor of linguistics at the University of the Ryukyus, or Ryukyuan. As a semanticist, he looks at how languages convey meaning, and how people use language to convey meaning. In particular, he looks at Yaeyaman, which is one of the Ryukyuan languages spoken in Okinawa Prefecture, and he tries to understand how this language works systematically. Professor Davis is a goldmine of interesting topics. In this episode, there are two main threads of conversation. The first half explores his work in Okinawa Prefecture. We talk about the history and geopolitics of Okinawa to help explain its linguistic situation, the scientific and cultural value in understanding diverse language systems, and some of the ethical considerations academics have to think about with fieldwork involving people, and indeed our primate cousins. The second half switches gears to look at some broader topics in linguistics. We talk about political correctness and freedom of speech, implicit meanings communicated through context, and some questionable studies trying to teach animals human language. Oh, and we also talk about a fun new field of study called Pokémonastics. There was so much more to talk about, and I really hope we get to go for a round 2 sometime, either on or off mic. Professor Davis has a wealth of knowledge within his field, but also fresh insights on some of the issues dominating political discussions in the West today. And like his own research, there's a sense that he approaches these topics with care and respect, something public discourse should also be aiming for. As you'll hear, it's a fun and lively discussion, packed full of interesting facts and practical advice. So, please enjoy this conversation with Professor Chris Davis. So, do I call you Davis-san or Davis-sensei?
You can call me Chris.
Chris.
Yeah.
Chris, welcome to WonderLabs.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
I thought it would be nice, actually, if we could talk about how we met. So we met at an event in Okinawa called Nerd Night.
That's right.
Where nerds come.
You've just outed me as a nerd.
You're about to out yourself in about 30 seconds
very
anyway.
Good.
So.
Okay. Yeah, right. At Nerd Night.
Yeah, so what was your presentation about?
Right. It was about, the title is unutterable on this podcast.
Frick.
Yeah, frick. Okay.
Frickin' whatever.
What frickin' can teach us about language where frickin' is replaced with the actual word? Yeah, it was about the semantics of words like the F word, which in this kind of context are contributing some kind of mysterious meaning component to an utterance that contains them. But yeah, that talk was about these sort of taboo words that we have. There's a whole range of them in English, and that was the focus of the talk. But obviously, as it turns out, any language will have a range of words like this. And the interest was, actually the talk was split into 2 parts. One was about the sort of grammar of these words, and another was about the semantics. So in the grammar section, I talked about this funny phenomenon in English, which has gotten the label amongst linguists of expletive infixation. And that fancy word refers to things like when you say the word fantastic and you want to emphasize just how fantastic it was.
Fan-frickin-tastic.
That is correct. And you do not say, for example, fantas-frickin-tic or fa-frickin-stastic or something.
Wonder-frickin-labs.
Wonder-frickin-labs.
Right.
Not one frickin' labs, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So there is this interesting distributional question, which is, the kind of scientific puzzle is given an input like fantastic or wonder labs or whatever, and given the fact that you can insert this word inside of it, where do you split the word into two parts? And it turns out there's work on this that shows that it's systematic and it's governed by a certain kind of structural considerations of how words in English are put together in terms of how the sounds are organized. The second part of the talk, of course, was getting to what is actually my own research in this area, which is what's the difference in meaning between, for example, fantastic and fan-frickin-tastic. At first glance, it's not obvious how you would even answer that kind of question. But I sort of gave a hint in the talk about how that's been thought about and how those types of words or those kinds of expressions have led researchers to talk about different types of meaning that language might encode. In the terms of the biz, we have what's called truth conditional meaning, those kind of elements that change under what circumstances a sentence would be evaluated as true or false. That's sort of your run-of-the-mill words. So if you switch out dog for cat in a sentence, there's a dog under the table. There's a cat under the table. This obviously changes the meaning in terms of what makes the sentence true or false. If we add a normal adjective, there's a black dog under the table. There's a white dog under the table. Again, the world has to be different for either of those two sentences to be true, okay? But if I compare a sentence, there's a dog under the table, there's a frickin' dog under the table, it seems like the conditions that sentence imposes on the world for the sentence to be true is exactly the same, but there's some extra element of indication of the speaker's emotional state, his evaluative stance, and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what sort of we talked about, or I talked about at Nerd Night in an appropriately nerdy and less G-rated fashion.
Love it.
Yeah.
And there's a frickin' dog under the table, and there's a dog under the frickin' table, and like all those kind of distinctions.
Yeah, right. And that's actually another interesting place where these in this particular context, frickin' is acting roughly like an adjective syntactically, or looks like it, right?
Which conveys some kind of intent about how you feel about that situation.
Yeah, about the situation. What's interesting, so if you think about a normal adjective, so again, use the adjective black. There's a black dog under the table versus there's a dog under the black table. Okay. Whether I put black in front of table or whether I put it in front of dog clearly changes what I just called the truth conditional content of the sentence, the circumstances under which the sentence will be true. It doesn't seem to work that way with frickin', right? There's a frickin' dog under the table. There's a dog under the frickin' table. It doesn't seem like in the first sentence I'm complaining about the dog, and in the second sentence I'm complaining about the table. So it's somehow less clear how the meaning of frickin' is composing with the meaning of the thing it's attaching to syntactically, right? So
all of that got us to where we are today.
Yes,
and
yes.
Inspired me to want to pick your brains a little bit more about yourself and your research.
Okay.
So, first of all, what brought you from the US to sunny Okinawa?
Yeah, well, in short, I am from Fort Worth, Texas, and I went up to Massachusetts for grad school to become a linguist. And in the course of pursuing my PhD and writing my dissertation, I was working on the semantics of what are called sentence final particles in Japanese. So in Japanese, you put these little words at the end of sentences. And just like we were talking about with frickin' in English, these words don't seem to affect what I call the truth conditions. That their meaning has something to do with how the speaker is intending that utterance to affect the listener maybe, or what his or her stance is towards the content of the sentence or so on. And in the course of that work, I became aware of these quote-unquote dialects spoken in Okinawa. And I became interested. I read some things that indicated they had some interesting properties from the perspective of a linguist. I got an opportunity to do a postdoc. In the course of this research, I came to realize that these so-called dialects were probably better described as languages which were related to Japanese, but different enough that they deserved to be sort of regarded as languages in their own right and studied from that perspective. So after that postdoc, I got a job at the University of the Ryukyus, and since it's a little over 7 years ago, and I've been continuing my work mostly on Yaeyaman, one of the Ryukyuan languages, one of the languages that's spoken in Okinawa and some islands north of Okinawa as well.
Before I tap into that, maybe it's worth giving a brief summary, at least of your interpretation of Okinawan history, because I think the geopolitics, the history might actually launch us into a conversation about these languages and why they're different.
So let me start with a caveat. Like any good academic, I must say, this is not my area of expertise by any means, right? Essentially, if we think about Okinawa, which is currently, right now, a prefecture in the Japanese nation state. It's the southernmost of these states, right, these prefectures. When did it become a prefecture of Japan? Well, there's this question about Japanese history. So the modern Japanese nation state, came about in the Meiji period, so at the second half of the 19th century. And Okinawa, what's now Okinawa, up to that point had been an independent kingdom. Okay, the Ryukyu kingdom, as it's called. I say independent. It was a tributary state to China. So it had these sort of trade relations with China, and its king, the king of the Ryukyu kingdom, would be vetted or approved or that by the Chinese delegates. So there was some kind of relationship like that. Simultaneously, sometime in the early 17th century, feudal Japan, the southernmost domain of feudal Japan, Satsuma, had sort of invaded into the Ryukyu kingdom, taken over a number of islands. Long story short, you had an independent kingdom with some kind of relationship with Japan. So basically you had a semi-autonomous kingdom that was simultaneously paying taxes to Japan and had some kind of relationship going on with China. Okay, the Meiji Restoration happens, and then the Ryukyu kingdom is dissolved and annexed into the modern Japanese nation state as Okinawa Prefecture, essentially by force. So there was a kind of a forced annexation. And so Okinawa's history within the nation state of Japan is relatively more complicated than other parts of Japan and less, has been cut off from the rest of Japan politically for most of its history. Final thing, World War II happens. The only land battle to occur on Japanese soil happens in Okinawa, and after the surrender of the Japanese, Okinawa is sort of given over to the U.S. administration, which continues until 1972. So there's this period between 1945 and 1972 where all of Okinawa Prefecture is not under the administrative control of Japan. So the amount of time that Okinawa has spent as a directly incorporated state in the Japanese nation state is relatively short, and it's also broken up with this 1945 to 1972 period. That's my understanding, in brief, not so brief, of Okinawan history.
No, that's good, because I think that does have some ramifications for linguistics and for language here.
Absolutely.
Do you know anything about dialect cards?
Yes. In Japanese, they're called hogen fuda, right? So, going back to the Japanese history thing. So, we're talking about Okinawa. Linguistically speaking, the divide really is between what we can call the Ryukyuan language group and then the Japanese, the non-Ryukyuan Japanese language group. Now, after the Okinawa is incorporated into the modern Japanese nation state, the Japanese nation state has a language policy, which is that everyone is supposed to learn, quote-unquote, standard Japanese, roughly speaking, the kind of Japanese that's spoken by a certain kind of elite in the Tokyo area. Okay, so there's this standard Japanese that was developed. Everyone's supposed to learn it in school. And not only that, there was a movement to not only add standard Japanese to whatever language or dialect you might otherwise be speaking, but to stop speaking that non-standard Japanese language or dialect. And so these dialect cards, or these hogen fuda, as they're called in Japanese, were a method by which in the school system, kids who spoke their quote-unquote dialect in the schools would be sort of punished or singled out by having these sort of wooden placards hung around their necks.
It's a bit like in
a
the UK,
dunce cap.
like a dunce cap, exactly.
Yeah, it's like a dunce cap, exactly. So there was like systematic attempt to, and a rather successful attempt to get people to undergo massive, what we call in the business, language shift. So not adding another language to your repertoire, but to abandon one language in lieu of another preferred language, in this case, the national language, Standard Japanese. So the result of this kind of policy and other sort of features, I mean, it's not purely the result maybe of the policy. There's other reasons people switch from one language to another in their daily lives. But in any case, the people tended to stop to switch over to using Japanese in their daily lives, and the result is that in Okinawa Prefecture, people that speak the traditional languages and dialects of the region tend to be age-wise, it depends on the region and so on and the person, but let's say maybe in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and older. People that are younger than that, by and large, tend to be monolingual Japanese speakers. So traditionally, all these things are called dialects. These days, I hesitate to say most linguists. Linguists are an ornery bunch. People have different opinions and so on. But it's commonly agreed by a large number of people at this point that the right way to think about what has been traditionally called Japanese and its dialects is to say, okay, there's this Japonic language group. There's this Japanese language group, similar to the Romance language group. They all have a common ancestor, similar to how the Romance language group has Latin as a common ancestor, and then separately developed different features, become different enough that we call them different languages, right? Okay, so the big split is between the Yamato, or the Japanese, the mainland Japanese branch, and the Ryukyuan branch, which includes Okinawa. Okay. Within this Ryukyuan branch, most scholars would agree there's at least 5 separate languages. The big split there is between Northern Ryukyuan, which includes Okinawa, as well as islands north of Okinawa, but part of Kagoshima Prefecture. That's the Northern Ryukyuan group. Then there's a big stretch of ocean with no islands between Okinawa to Miyako, forms a natural geographic boundary, which stimulates language evolution and differentiation. And then you get the Southern Ryukyuan group. You get the Miyako language, and then you get what's sometimes called the macro Yaeyaman language. That macro Yaeyaman language is broken up then into Yaeyaman and then Yonaguni. So this small island all the way to the southwest, very close to Taiwan, actually.
Yeah, closer to Taiwan than it is to Okinawa.
Exactly, right? Absolutely. It's it's commonly treated as having its own language, which is related to the other varieties spoken in Yaeyama, which centers on the island of Ishigaki and these islands around there. So my work focuses on Yaeyaman, not Yonaguni. So all the varieties of Yaeyaman, but excluding Yonaguni. Not for any principled reason, but just because of a limitation of time and travel budget, right?
So what specifically are you looking at in that language?
Right. So when I started off, I mentioned I'm a semanticist, and in particular, I'm a semanticist someone who studies linguistic meaning, broadly speaking. So how is it that languages encode meaning? How is it that speakers of languages use aspects of those languages to encode the meanings they wish to convey? Okay. So I'm a semanticist. And when I as I was mentioning, a lot of my interests are in things like swear words, sentence final particles in Japanese, things that are part of the language which in some sense have a meaning, but whose meaning is of a weird kind, a kind it's hard to say what its informational content is, or it might not even have, strictly speaking, informational content the way that normal, as it were, so-called normal parts of the language would have. So originally I came down to Yaeyama because Yaeyaman, its dialects and its various dialects, has certain properties that interested me as a semanticist. But once I started doing the field work, I realized just how different these varieties were from Japanese, and I realized how there was not yet enough of a systematic understanding of the language as a whole, that the language was, this language was not well documented yet, that there were fundamental aspects of the language's grammar and so on that were still not well understood, that needed to be described and analyzed, and that if no one else is going to do it, I should do it. And so, although I started off with a sort of narrow interest in these sort of semantic areas, I've since become involved with more general description of the language, which goes everywhere from how the sound system works to, how you put sentences together, all the way to what I was just talking about. How is it that these different parts of the language contribute to the meaning of any given utterance? So,
in that sense, then, the subjects that you work with in the field are a way of extracting the features of the language so that you can then document it. Or
I want to be careful about how I describe this because, from a scientific perspective, right?
You're working with people.
You're working with people, and it is true that the target of the investigation is the language system. And, what linguists are in the business of doing is abstracting away from individual people and individual interactions to some kind of notion of language as an object that can be studied. And it's studied by getting data about the language. And data about the language comes in a few forms, right? We might have recordings of naturalistic speech, conversations and the like, that we can then analyze, naturalistic data. It can also come in the form of targeted questions to speakers of the language about, for example, is this something you can say in your language? Or could you say this, yes or no? So we get what are sometimes called grammaticality judgments, but more generally what we can call acceptability judgments. So we might want to know what are the possible sentences in the language, which sentences are okay for speakers, which are not, and why. Which sentences can be used in which circumstances, and why. And so that's correct that these so-called native speakers of the language become these sort of sources of data. On the other hand, I want to be very careful about how we talk about this stuff because I don't want to treat this research as a kind of data extraction exercise, sometimes called salvage linguistics. Like there's this sunken ship that we've got to go extract useful cargo from. With endangered languages, and these are all endangered languages, by which I mean these are languages which the younger generation has, by and large, ceased to speak. And unless there's a large-scale change in behavior amongst these communities, like there's an effort on the part of the younger generation to begin to speak these languages again, then it follows that the number of you can calculate how many years left you have to do primary research and collect primary data on these languages by looking at how old the youngest speaker is, right? That said, this view of language as an object needs to be supplemented by the view that language is this sort of cultural object as well, and it's this repository of cultural value for the people that use it. So when we come in as scientists and we say, hey, I'm interested in aspect X of this language and we're going to extract some data, sometimes that can come across as a bit disrespectful, right?
Yeah, and I've seen some of the studies that you conduct, and I think it's unavoidable that you're going to have this abstraction that takes place when you're trying to reduce a language to some of its fundamental properties and characteristics. But
that's right.
You can still treat people with humanity and decency and respect when they're participating in a study. And
that's right. I think this is a general issue in the the human sciences, right? So anyone who has human, we don't call them subjects anymore, do we? Participants in their studies.
I think I used the word subjects earlier in the show, so I will stand corrected. And
yes, well, it's just one of these sort of consciousness-raising things. So actually, I read a paper that I downloaded off of an archive called LingBuzz, which is where all the the linguists go to get the latest research in the field, right?
Ling Buzz.
Ling Buzz. So anybody who's curious what the linguists are up to these days can go to Ling Buzz, download for free PDFs of papers sorted by field and so on. In any case, there was a paper that was looking at certain kind of learning experiments that were conducted on a certain species of monkey. I can't remember which kind. I think it was a kind of monkey. The point was I was reading this study, which you might wonder how this is related to language, but put that aside for a second. And I was my eyebrows raised when I noticed that the monkeys were described as participants. And in fact, there was a protocol in there that they didn't force the monkeys to participate in the experiment. They sort of made the experiment available in their living, I think they're kept at some kind of a primate research facility. And so there's even been a move towards treating these, our primate cousins, subjects. I noticed at least one paper that had moved towards this participant language, which in sort of giving the monkeys some sort of autonomy in their ability to choose, as it were, to participate in this. I noticed that recently. And actually, I mean, I was sort of teasing a little bit about the subject-participant distinction, but actually, this raises an interesting point, which is related to something that we might want to talk about, which is I was talking about expressive meaning. I think I used that word, but this idea that, okay, what does it mean when you add the word frickin' to a sentence? And it's clear that it doesn't change the core informational content that the sentence conveys, and that maybe what it's doing is giving you some indication of the speaker's emotional state, attitudinal stance, evaluation of the situation, and so on. Similarly, we might say, well, look, whether you say subject or participant, surely it's the same thing you're referring to. That is to say, the informational content of those two words is equivalent in the experimental context. It means the people from whom, or the creatures, or that we extracted data from, right? But there's some aspect to whether you subject or participant that sort of indicates some view about how they came to participate in the study, for example, right?
Right.
There's something about the word subject feels different than the word participant in terms of how much agency you're giving and how much humanity you're giving to the target of those descriptors. So it's kind of an interesting... It's unclear to me, even as a semanticist, how to think about that difference, but it seems to be there for sure.
And now I'm going to notice them all the time. And I noticed one just as you were speaking. So I agree about the idea of data extraction, data harvesting, people harvesting my data.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, when Facebook or Google harvests my data, they're not taking anything away from me, really. But it does feel like they are. So is it extraction?
That's a really interesting question. This really gets to us to what is the nature of how does ownership of information work? Where, when you copy information, there's no loss of the original object. All there is a replication of it, and it's made accessible to someone else.
Some advertiser's server somewhere. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's an interesting issue. I mean, so for example, when you're working on languages spoken by for various reasons, it might be endangered languages, it might be languages spoken by marginalized groups of people, indigenous people in different circumstances. It's sometimes the case that the issue of ownership of the language comes up. Who has the right to reproduce examples of that language? Who has the right to sort of, use the language as a object? Actually, I think it's an important thing when we talk about these cultural properties, which is kind of what these are. In the case of, we have an entire legal system that's organized around making sure that people who produce these easily copyable properties, books, music, film, podcasts, and so on, are protected against unlicensed reproductions and distributions of those products.
Interestingly, I came across something recently that was talking about the different layers of a music track and which ones are more subject to copyright infringement
Oh
claims.
my, that's interesting.
And some of the percussion and the bass that's traditionally associated with some of these marginalized groups is not seen as the defining feature of the song. And like, oh, that's just a part of this particular genre, so you have no copyright claim to this.
I see. Well, I guess what I will say is one thing you can think about is, people sometimes use the word like cultural appropriation, and, what do we mean by that? And, one way we might think about that is, we have an entire, like I said, a legal system that protects powerful people with money, properties, intellectual properties, right? And we don't really have a system in place to think about even these sort of intangible properties that don't belong to individuals or to companies that had a moment of creation that sort of, and by which the copyright came into existence. But these things, for example, languages or language practices that are associated with a particular group of people that in some sense belong to that people. And so when I come in as a researcher and I'm working on these languages, I think I've been made more sensitive in recent years to the fact that, when I quote unquote extract this data, then that is the function it has in the context of my research, but it isn't just data. It is also a cultural property of those people. So I feel like we have to be careful about how we think about the data we're talking about. Yeah, in linguistics, especially when we're working on languages that again are spoken by groups of people that in some sense or another have been marginalized.
And that brings us right back to where I wanted to go to. So you focus on endangered languages.
That's right. And actually, this term endangered languages, we were talking about subject versus participant. Endangered languages is also a word that's commonly used that we should maybe be careful about. There have been people who've pointed out that this might be a problematic term itself. But
what's the alternative?
Right. Well, that's a good question. So essentially, the metaphor that's being used when we say something like endangered languages is we're obviously making some kind of metaphor with species, because that's the other main place we use that word, right? We talk about endangered species. And what do we talk about when we talk about endangered species? What we mean is a species that we think, given the current circumstances, and if nothing is done to change the course of things, is likely to stop existing. So what does that mean in the context of language? Like how does that metaphor work? And normally what it means is we think that how many people are there who speak that language, right? We can count that roughly. And is that number stable? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? And in a context where how do languages, continue to be spoken? And in the normal situation, what happens is there's a community of people that speak that language to one another. They have children. Their children acquire that language and then speak it with people of their same generation. And so that's the reproductive cycle of languages, right? So if that reproductive cycle is interrupted, for example, the kids get sent off to school, switch to speaking a different language, and do no longer speak the language of that community, have their own children, fail to speak the language to their children, and so that next generation doesn't even understand the language. They hear it, they can't understand what it means. But there's always some circumstances that lead to this, right? Some pressure on the speakers of these languages to switch to speaking another language. That pressure might be economic, it might be political, it might be
environmental.
Absolutely. I think we're going to see this increasingly in with global warming, right?
Yeah.
We're going to have environmental refugees or people who have had to move to a new location. So if you move to an area where there's another dominant language, it's going to be difficult to avoid this language shift situation. But in any case, so when I talk about endangered languages, that's what I mean. Languages that are threatened with a situation where there are no longer people who speak the language at all, or no longer speak the language as a first language fluent speaker. Now, one of the problems with this terminology about endangered language, for example, is what about people who learn the language as a second language, as a heritage language? Do they not count as speakers of the language? What about, we might want to distinguish situations where the language stops being spoken and there is no record of it, versus a situation where the language stops being spoken but there's a rich record of it. It might have texts that have been written down, recordings that have been made, dictionaries have been produced, so that in such a circumstance, someone who wanted to learn the language as a quote-unquote second language could use those resources to learn it. And so that term endangered language doesn't really distinguish all of these different circumstances. So one aspect of my research, a very small part, but a part of my research is contributing just a little bit to the documentation of these languages, and thereby creating a situation where even if the number of speakers of these languages becomes zero, there will still be a physical record of the language that could then be used by anyone who was interested in trying to revitalize or recover the language at a later date.
And beyond that documentation exercise, what are the other benefits of understanding these languages, and specifically the languages here in the Okinawa Prefecture?
Right. So I've kind of, what I was just talking about, I was sort of putting attention on the communities and the situations they face. So just before I answer, so there is this value. These languages you can think of as having two clear values, right? There's the value of them as repositories of cultural value. These languages have evolved from in a particular community, spoken by a particular group of people in a particular circumstances, and so on. And they're a repository of cultural value for those groups of people. And when they disappear, those people lose access to some aspect of their cultural identity. So there's that kind of value, right? There's also a scientific value to these languages. So from the perspective of a linguist, a language spoken by 1 billion people and a language spoken by, a handful of people it turns out, will be equally complicated objects. It's a common misconception that, well, there's going to be complicated languages in the world, and then there's going to be some primitive languages that won't be as complicated as the real complicated languages. And that's just not empirically correct. I mean, the best evidence we have is that, for example, grammatical complexity does not correlate with other kinds of what we might call complexity of material culture. That just seems to be false, right? Any language that's been examined, there's maybe 6,000 to 7,000 languages currently spoken on Earth. They all have these amazingly complex properties, and they are all different from one another in some way, right? And what that means is that any one of those languages provides us a unique window into what kind of thing a human language can be. So that's one of the things that linguists are interested in, right? Like, not what is English, what is German, what is Swahili, but what is human language generally, abstracting away from the specific examples. And the only way to answer that question is to get lots of information about lots of specific examples, right? If you only had a sample size of 10 languages and you discovered that all 10 languages had property X, and you concluded human language has property X, it might just be the fact that you didn't look at enough examples of languages, and you might have found one that didn't have property X, or that had a slightly different version of property X. And so one of the reasons that language endangerment is a kind of scientific crisis as well as a cultural crisis, humanitarian crisis, but it's also a huge scientific loss, because we will lose the ability to find out what is possible for humans in terms of the kinds of linguistic systems that can evolve amongst human societies, that can be learned by human beings, and so on. So that's, at a very general level, any language is equally valuable in what it can tell us about the human language faculty.
So when it comes to quote-unquote endangered languages,
right,
you touched on some of the possible causes and also the consequences and effects. I'm just wondering what interventions or strategies there might be toward shifting that outcome.
Right. And this goes well beyond my expertise. Again, my day job involves me going to speakers, when it comes to these languages anyway, to speakers of Yaeyaman, recording them, asking them questions of, to judge different judgments about particular sentences in particular contexts, and then describing to the best of my ability features of the language, right? So with that caveat said, what kind of things can be done? And there are examples in the world of language, what sometimes are called language revitalization or also language reclamation projects. So just as an example that comes to the top of my head, in Hawaii, the Hawaiian language, for a very obvious set of reasons, underwent a period of steep decline in use, right? So basically Hawaii is conquered by some capitalists from America who want to grow bananas, I think. And it's taken over, and the indigenous population is soon outnumbered by other people. There's a pressure on them to no longer speak Hawaiian. Hawaiian goes into decline. Starting in the 1970s, I believe there's something called the Hawaiian Renaissance. So indigenous Hawaiian people start to reclaim different aspects of their culture. One aspect is this is language. At that time, there was a very small number of people who were still able to speak Hawaiian fluently, but there was a big effort to use the few speakers of Hawaiian remaining as a resource so that a younger generation could reclaim and begin to speak their language again. And in Hawaii today, you have Hawaiian languages, you have immersion schools that so you send your kids to these schools. It's all conducted in Hawaiian. You can take courses, I believe at the University of Hawaii, there are courses that are done in Hawaiian. They have Hawaiian language courses at the university. So at the very least, you have a very strong resurgence of fluent second language speakers and for all I know, first language speakers as well. Yeah, so perhaps. This is the type of effort that you see, just as one example, the Hawaiian example, which I've seen a little bit firsthand, which is why I bring it up. But those kind of examples, it's very hard though. It's the factors underlying the shift, as long as those are around, it's going to be, you're pushing against a very
strong
big
pressure,
force. Yeah, that's right. And so it's a difficult thing to do, but there are cases that are encouraging here and there in the world. So in the case of the Ryukyus, in the case of Okinawa, there has been a fair amount of recognition of this as a problem in recent years in Okinawa Prefecture itself. So sometime in the 2000s, UNESCO recognized officially the existence of a surprising number of languages in Japan for Japanese people, right? So, for example, there's Ainu. Anyone who knows anything about languages in Japan knows that there's at least Japanese and Ainu. And Ainu is an unrelated language that's traditionally spoken in the northernmost part of Japan. These days, it's associated with Hokkaido, right? But UNESCO recognized, I believe, 7 other languages. They recognized 6 Ryukyuan languages in any case. That official recognition seems to have provided some impetus to a reevaluation, because again, we were talking about words. We were talking about subject versus participant. And, well, if it refers to the same thing, is it really a big deal? Well, we could talk about this with language, too. Whether you refer to something as a dialect or as a language, we can come up with criteria for the use of these terms, and linguists, do try to do this. And, based on those, there's good reasons sort of from linguistic grounds to distinguish various varieties spoken in the Ryukyus as languages that are historically related to Japanese rather than as being dialects of Japanese. But beyond that sort of empirical question about the line between dialect and language, or that definitional question really, there's this fact that when you describe something as a dialect, it tends to not be valued as much as if you describe it as a language, right? It's a weird thing. We can be talking about the exact same thing, and just by calling it a language, all of a sudden it acquires a different status. So in the case of the Ryukyus, there's been this shift for example, UNESCO officially recognizing these as languages sort of, I think, triggered a broader conversation. I think that various researchers have started to use that kind of terminology, and it's sort of trickled down to some level of popular consciousness. And also, there's just been a bottom-up recognition on the part of people in Okinawa that they're losing some aspect of their own cultural uniqueness, right? With the sort of homogenization that comes from this kind of expansion of the standard language. So the question then is, what kind of resources are available to them? What kind of how can you engineer the circumstances to maximally facilitate their interest in those things and to have the maximal possibility for success? And I think that's the question that I can't answer. You would have to ask someone else who has a different type of expertise on things like language policy and language revitalization as its own area of study.
The UNESCO label, I think, is particularly interesting. And I think you see much the same thing geographically. I know we made the comparison between endangered languages, endangered species, but when a particular place gets that UNESCO seal, it changes the behavior of the people that live there. And there's often this sense of prestige and pride that goes along with being a UNESCO World Heritage space.
Right.
And that almost gives people a reason to embrace the space more and take care of it. And I suppose the same thing seems to be true of languages.
I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, I mentioned lots of factors that might underlie language shift, again, is the word we can use here, switching from using one language to using another. And again, it's important to, me and you both come from countries whose native citizens are by and large monolingual, yeah?
Yeah,
the Anglophone world tends to be shockingly monolingual, but
why would it be shocking? I could go to any country and they have an English menu.
There you go. That's right. Right here in Japan.
Why would I have to learn any other language?
Exactly. Right. So, so I think sometimes what that does is it gives people from Anglophone countries a false idea about what's a normal linguistic situation for human beings, right? Again, this goes back to this sort of, linguistic diversity providing a lens onto what it actually means to be human from the perspective of languages.
Right.
Well, similarly, modern nation states with a single national language are a very recent development, yeah? And it's probably the case that human beings are it's absolutely the case that people can and do learn a multiplicity of languages from a young age and are able to deploy these languages in different circumstances. So multilingualism is actually probably a very common situation. That being said, a language shift is a case where you're not adding a language to your repertoire of languages, but you're abandoning one language in favor of another, right? That's right. So going back to why that might happen, you mentioned this sort of shaming, like, you have this policy in the schools where you are banned from speaking the language, and if you speak it, you're given, the dunce cap or something. You can enforce this by violence. People are, there are cases where people are killed or otherwise subjected to violence for speaking the wrong language. You can imagine all kinds of economic consequences. Me and you talked about if either of us were to go to a job interview and speak our native dialect of English, we would suffer a big downward bump in how we would be likely to be evaluated.
There's a big cost associated with that.
That's correct. Yeah. There's a big cost associated with speaking that language. So that gets you to this business what you just talked about, prestige. So what happens is either with various low prestige dialects of a particular language or languages themselves that have a history of being associated with low prestige for one reason or another, giving them any kind of action that tends towards elevating the prestige of those languages is going to be one way in which this type of language shift can be combated or counteracted, I think. And like you said, the UNESCO labeling might be such a thing, right? And just the use of the word language versus dialect. I think it's fair to say that sometimes the word dialect is used as a kind of a disparaging term. right? People say things like, he speaks dialect, not he speaks such and such dialect, but just dialect, as opposed to what? As opposed to language, as opposed to some kind of standard variety of language, as opposed to a prestigious variety. People don't tend to call prestigious varieties of a language dialects, right? So, for example, people don't tend to call RP a dialect. I don't think that's...
Received pronunciation.
Yes, I apologize. That's right.
No, it's good.
So, for example, Southern English, London area, non-working class, sort of upper class English is not thought of by its speakers as a dialect of English. That's just English.
Absolutely.
Other people speak dialects.
Dialects is something that other people speak.
Right. So from the linguistic perspective, from the perspective of a linguist, that's absurd, right? That would be like saying, this is a finch, a real finch, and everything else is a subspecies of a finch. Right. That's absurd. Yeah. Everything's equally a subspecies of a species, and everything is equally a dialect of a language if these things are in fact dialects, right? So that flattening out of the prestige landscape would be a very big step towards combating this type of situation, I think.
So to wrap that all up, it's not just semantics.
It is not just semantics, not at all.
So moving on to some broader topics in linguistics, do you have any thoughts on the policing of language and quote-unquote unsayable words?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts, not all of them articulate enough to make it worth saying on a podcast, but my read on the cultural climate in the Anglosphere. I mean, there's a long cultural history of this about language taboos being associated with sort of uptight, illiberal minds, right? So that I think going back to the 1960s and the 1970s, speaking freely was associated with a certain type of countercultural and maybe even politically speaking on the left end of the spectrum.
Correct. And it was the right that was doing the policing
that's
of
right.
language.
And so I think it's a common cultural trope right now, especially in the political environment we find ourselves on in the United States, where political correctness has become this charged term that people, roughly speaking, on the right accuse people, roughly speaking, on the left of being, slaves to. And that, when complaints are lodged about certain kinds of language being used, that is, as the phrase goes, that's political correctness gone mad. Okay. Yeah. So there is at a very superficial, from a superficial perspective, it looks as though there's been this shift from, progressive left-wing countercultural types are the ones who are fighting against language policing, and now it's this embattled, just the man of reason that's sort of somewhat politically conservative, kind of defending the rights of a citizen, free citizen of a liberal democracy to say what comes to their mind. Right? That's a common construal of the situation, I think.
I think that's right.
I want to sort of call into question the apparent sort of parallel between the whatever you might think of the 60s, 70s countercultural, the George Carlin 7 words you can't say on TV sketch. I don't know if your listeners or if you are familiar with this, but there was the FCC in the United States had these words you can't say on broadcast television, and the comedian George Carlin has this famous skit where he continuously says them. And then, and it's sort of raising the absurdity of these bannings of words, right? And so why is that any different than, for example, language policing about things like language used to refer to different kind of marginalized groups of people and so on? And I think there's something fundamentally different about a taboo against, for example, the F word used not to refer to a sexual act, but just as a kind of emphasizer in language. This would be a kind of clear case of the kind of thing where a cultural conservative would get offended. So the question from my perspective is, language policing, that's a complicated thing, right? Should governments legislate what people can and can't say? And I mean, at some level, I don't think it's the case that even in the most liberal societies, there isn't policing of linguistic expression. It's just not true that people are free to say anything and everything. So if we think about uptightness about language, like why does it seem kind of silly to a lot of us that people would get flustered about the F word inserted in the word fantastic when it says fan-freaking-tastic? And I think the reason it feels absurd to some of us is that surely there's no harm there. Surely nothing in the world has changed because of this, right? But I feel as if this can be extended into a view of quote-unquote free speech, which is that speech is and should be free because what harm is there in speech? And I think this is disrespectful to speech. I think this minimizes the extent to which fundamentally speech is action, just like any other action. And it has, anytime someone makes speech, anytime someone says something in the public sphere, it has consequences, right?
I mean, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me.
Right.
It's another one of those idioms that makes no sense.
Exactly. It's just false. I think that when it comes to this kind of these sort of language issues, we have to recognize that there are terms whose history of usage makes them so charged that I'm not suggesting that they have to be banned by law, but that you have to take responsibility for the consequences that their utterance has. Similar to the fire in the crowded theater example that's commonly brought out in context in the United States, where according to the popular conception of these things, it's not legal to yell fire in a crowded theater because it can cause a mass panic, and therefore this is a legitimate target for restrictions on speech. I think we should recognize that it's unlikely that inserting the F word into one's sentences can cause anything like the mass panic in a theater context to emerge. However, racial epithets, right, describing groups of people using words that minimize their humanity in some way or make them more legitimate targets of violence, okay? We have plenty of historical examples of this that led to genocide. So in Nazi Germany, when it came to the Jews, in Rwanda, right? Mm-hmm. So you had physical violence and, in fact, genocide preceded in time by a kind of linguistic violence. And I think it behooves us to consider what it means to have that the notion of linguistic violence is not an absurd concept, that free speech is not. Speech should not be free because speech doesn't mean anything and doesn't have any effect on the world. The reason we have to protect free speech is because speech is powerful and has the potential to affect the world, and that we want to ensure that regular people have the power to affect the world through speech. But with that means I think we have to be serious about kinds of speech that have the potential to do harm. Now, what do we do about that when we say, okay, if we have speech like that in the public sphere, should we somehow legislate its use? Well, that's a policy question. I can't answer that. All I can say as a linguist is that it's wrong to think that language is just inert, that these labels that we use to pick out different groups of people could just be substituted, a rose by any other name. Yeah, that logically that's correct, but in the terms of actual languages spoken by actual people, it turns out that two different words to pick out the same group of people can have deeply and vastly different impacts on that group of people themselves and on how the rest of us end up conceiving of those people and thinking about them. So I think we have to be kind of cognizant of the power that language has.
Are there any words that are currently deemed acceptable in popular discourse? Words that you think might fall out of favor or should fall out of favor soon?
That's a really interesting question, and I have the feeling that what is popularly acceptable, it's hard to know what that is because I feel there's such a fragmentation along political lines and other lines about what kind of speech is normalized and what kind of speech is taboo in some sense, is rather different in different sub-communities of English speakers. So it's really hard for me to put my finger on one. However, I would say that I think that we need to have a discourse. So we have a discourse to some extent about words that themselves are considered taboo, that are used to somehow disparage a group of people. So this is the classic examples of slurs, like the N-word, right? Refers to a group of people and simultaneously does some kind of damage, is what I would say. But in any case, at the very least, it triggers certain associations, historical kind of perspectives on that group of people that are very problematic, to say the least, okay? So we can have a debate about for example, should a platform like Facebook just make a blanket ban on terms like that? And that can be problematic because those terms are not always used to trigger those kind of meanings. In particular, members of the group thus targeted can, as we say, reclaim the term and use it with a very different effect, okay? Famously in the case of the word I'm referring to right now. So that's one of the issues about these words that themselves are loaded. There's another issue, though, that I think deserves more attention, which is this notion. It's gotten the term dog whistle associated with it. So you know what an actual dog whistle is. It's a little whistle that you can make sounds at a frequency that's above those which human ears can detect, but is well within the range that will bother a dog. And so you can blow this silent to human whistles and dogs will hear it.
They have something similar installed on street corners in England
to
keep teenagers
away from
whistles.
Yes, so this is very controversial, right? Yeah, I've read about this. So you've taken the dog whistle idea and you've installed these. I think it's like they have them playing at about 18,000 hertz, something like this. Yeah. Anyway, so okay.
Dog whistling.
So in the context of language, what I mean by dog whistling is when someone uses an apparently innocuous expression. To one group of people, it sounds like an innocuous description, but to people in the know, to people that are part of a certain subcommunity, they will read that as, oh, this person is signaling to us this attitude he has that we share, and so we know he's one of us. So this has come into some prominence with the rise of Donald Trump in the United States and associated, basically this question about, is Donald Trump and associated politicians pandering in some way to so-called white nationalists, right? Other problematic groups of people. And there's a technique, there's a strategy one can use in one's language where you can use some turn of phrase that in the general population is just thought of as a neutral expression, but within that sub-community that you're trying to target is understood to be a signal, say, hey, I'm one of you, and I think the same way you do about these things, that and I can't say it out loud. Overtly, yeah. And this is an interesting case where it would not make, there is no way to ban this kind of speech, right? In principle. So even if you were into language policing, you couldn't police this on the obvious way, except for the fact that we can have a public discourse that looks for these kind of things, calls people out on it, and holds people to account. But that type of speech has an interesting property, which is plausible deniability, which is exactly why it's used, right? Because you can deny that, no, I was just saying, this. There's no extra meaning there.
I hate plausible deniability.
Absolutely. So I feel that is the area. It's not so much particular terms that I would target, but a certain kind of speech strategy that is used without repercussion sometimes in our public discourse. And if the media and if others could be trained to sort of see that for what it was and not take people's plausible denials of such things at face value and be more critical of that, that would be something I would like to see the culture move towards.
I want to shift away from language for a moment.
Okay.
So when you and I are having this conversation, there are many things that we're saying to each other that aren't captured by the audio, because often a lot of what we say is not necessarily our choice of words. And I'm wondering, in linguistics, how do you factor that in? The fact that so much of communication is not the language itself.
So we get just as much from what's not said as from what is said. So there's a famous example due to the philosopher Grice, who sort of was the one who really started to got people thinking about these kind of issues and how to maybe analyze them theoretically. So he has a famous example of I'll paraphrase, but basically someone is applying for a position in the philosophy department, and they have gotten a recommendation letter from their advisor, and their advisor writes in the recommendation letter, Mr. So-and-so always attended class on time and, was always well-groomed and never failed to brush his teeth. Sincerely, so-and-so. Okay. And what's your reaction to this recommendation letter? How do you interpret this? So, I'll ask you that.
If I were to receive that
letter
of recommendation? If
you were to receive this letter of recommendation along with the application packet for Mr. So-and-so applying to a position in your department, what would be your interpretation of this?
Pretty unremarkable, I mean.
Yeah, beyond it's pretty remarkably unremarkable, right? So what we all extract from this is that, something along the lines of, this is indicating to us this guy has no philosophical talent. He's not cut out to be a philosopher. Why? The interesting thing is nothing was said about this person's abilities as a philosopher. It was not part of the linguistic signal that we should say. We were not strictly told he's good at philosophy. We were not told he was bad at philosophy. But given that this is a recommendation letter for a position as adjunct faculty in the philosophy department, we somehow extract the following information. This person's skill as a philosopher is not good in some sense, right? I'm being told that something about this guy's skill in philosophy. So the logic here goes, well, why is that, given that it's not a linguistic signal? And the idea is that, well, given that this is a recommendation letter whose purpose is to establish this person's qualifications in philosophy, what is not said in that letter is as informative as what is said. And so there's this interesting thing that just in the speech signal itself, there's this whole layer of meaning that you can get access to based on thinking about what was said, comparing it to what that person might have said, and then running some kind of inferences on that, and coming away with the conclusion that, I'm being told that this person is probably not a good philosopher. Right. And I think that aspect of information that it's not in the speech signal, right? It's not in there, but somehow it was intended, you can take it that the person who wrote the recommendation letter, roughly speaking, intended to communicate that. And the person who receives it has that communication made pretty clearly to them without any such thing being part of the speech signal. So that is an area of what we sometimes call, it's sometimes called pragmatic enrichment. So in the biz, we distinguish two faces of meaning, the semantic and pragmatic. So semantic is, roughly speaking, those aspects of meaning that stem from the content of the speech signal itself. That words and their combinations have meanings because of the way they function in the linguistic system. A person who knows the linguistic system decodes that, essentially, and then converts it into meaning via some kind of, that's what it means to know English, for example, is to be able to do that. It's part of what it means to know English. And then those raw messages somehow end up getting enriched with additional information that wasn't in the original signal based on additional inferences that are made that are not purely linguistic. So there's this sort of two-step process where you first extract the basic meaning. You think about, okay, why might this person have told me about this guy's grooming habits and brushing his teeth? That doesn't seem relevant. He didn't give me any relevant information. He only gave me irrelevant kind of positive information.
I mean, another explanation could be that everyone else in the group is really disgusting and doesn't take care of themselves.
So that's
maybe they're all good at philosophy, but this Mr. So-and-so
guy
is like,
will be the one guy in your department,
and he scrubs up really well.
You can put him on television,
right?
So what's actually interesting about what you just did there is that what you've shown is that these pragmatic enrichments are incredibly context sensitive. They don't come from the signal itself. They come from some kind of additional background information combined with the linguistic signal, combined with general human reasoning on top of that.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we were given a background where this department is a bunch of Slavs and they have a bad reputation,
but they're pumping out Nobel Prize winners
yeah,
all
right.
the time.
But we need a spokesperson who can go on the BBC and tell. I don't know why if with you it's the BBC, but anyway,
speak their best perceived pronunciation.
Exactly. So he speaks RP very clearly, is always well groomed and has straight teeth.
Right.
Might be it's ringing endorsement if we are in a context where we're out. Yeah. So the point is that this additional information is absolutely not in the speech signal. It's also not in other overt signals like facial expressions and gestures and so on. So this is sort of a whole area of the study of meaning, what's typically called pragmatics. So basically the idea is that when you're studying meaning in language, again, we're putting aside gestures and all that. We're studying the linguistic signal in context to convey a message. We basically think that, there's part of that message that comes from decoding the linguistic signal as a linguistic signal, and there's part of the message that comes from considering other non-linguistic factors that are going to, why would this have been said? What's the relevance of this? To what end is this person saying this to me? And you enrich the communicative intent of what's said quite generally and without thinking about it. Interestingly, the theories that underpin, so that we have theories about how this works, and there's controversy about it, but the common theories we have about these is that this is a product of kind of rational inferencing made from, what's the meaning of the linguistic signal given my language system? What other information do I have about the speaker and the context and the communicative goals right now? And then you run these various kind of inferencing strategies, and you arrive at these conclusions. What's interesting about it is that it's pretty systematic. I mean, despite the fact that it's contextually sensitive, people are very good at doing this and quick about it. There's a whole area of research and looking into, do children do this very well? And where does children's inferencing on these kind of things differ from adults? And there's really interesting places where kids do things different than adults, and then you can sort of track about the time when they start to behave like adults and so on. So there's this whole world of research on the non-linguistic component of how it is that we enrich the core meaning of the things we hear and say with these sort of non-linguistic ingredients from the context and the general reasoning.
So there are some examples throughout history where we have attempted to teach animals language with varying degrees of success.
Right.
Maybe you can talk through some of those fun case studies.
Yeah. So this goes outside of my area of expertise again, except the general expertise of being a linguist. But the famous examples. There's Nim Chimpsky. There was a number of times. I think Coco the gorilla, who died a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And they basically there's been a number of attempts to basically teach some version of a human language to a non-human animal. In this case, another ape, right? Either a chimpanzee or a gorilla.
And they learn some words.
Yeah. So it's absolutely the case that, again, this isn't, I don't know all the details about this, but it is 100% true that they, in some sense or another, learned some words. And in fact, I think it was the case that Coco had something like a vocabulary of it was like a couple of hundred or some 200-300 something. When we talk about words, one of the earliest attempts, I forgot the name of the poor chimpanzee that was subjected to this, but I think there was an attempt to teach a chimpanzee to speak. And it was quickly, if you'd have taken an X-ray of its vocal tract, you would have realized that it just doesn't have the physical apparatus to make human speech sound. So that's a barrier to other apes communicating, right? Their tongues and their larynxes and stuff are not in the right place.
But it was definitely a subject and not a participant in that example.
I think we would say that these cases, it would be, I think it would be self-serving to call that poor chimpanzee a participant. Basically they moved on to some kind of communication system, basically human sign language, and then some kind of a board with little, right? I think in the case of Coco, they had these sort of pictures not pictures like that are drawings of things, but some kind of abstract symbols on represent. Yeah. Okay. So what the basic conclusion from the linguist's point of view is that these things are well oversold to the public. Like, Nim Chimpsky or whoever learned sign language, and ask a speaker of American Sign Language whether Nim Chimpsky learned sign language. The answer is no. What certainly happened is they learned to associate certain signs with certain kinds of environmental things, right? So like I think like they would learn a sign that means banana. Right. And then they might want a banana.
Well, I've got the longest sentence that Nim Chimpsky learned here, which is give orange, me give, eat orange, me.
Right.
Eat orange, give me. Eat orange, give me you.
Yes, that's wonderful. It is a very long sentence. There's actually a question. Should we call this a sentence? So basically, Nim Chimpsky had a number of words at his disposal. Amongst them, give, orange, me, eat, you. Yeah. And I think this quote-unquote sentence contains all of those words. So when you look at this, it's quite clear that the words have meaning, right? And it's clear that there was a communicative intent, roughly speaking, give me a banana to eat or something. But what distinguishes... Oh, sorry. An orange. It's such a stereotype that this chimpanzee... So this is Nim, right? Yeah. We're talking about. Yeah. So, the clear and distinct difference between this and any 3 or 4 year old human being learning English is that this is word salad. Like somehow the thing that this chimpanzee wanted to convey consisted of, there was an orange involved, I'm involved, you're involved, giving is involved, eating is involved, and it's just thrown these together. There's, as far as I know, no evidence that there's any systematic arrangement of the words, right? Yeah. Human language can do interesting things. Like this does not, we interpret this as you give me, Nim Chimpsky, an orange, but there's no reason that in the signal that tells us that this doesn't mean me, Nim Chimpsky, give you an orange. We're just generous in our interpretation that we know that in general it was the humans that were giving the chimpanzee the fruit, I guess. So the general, I think, view amongst linguists is that, these cousins of ours, they can acquire something like words, a certain number, right? Now, by the way, the number we're talking about, human beings easily acquired, tens of thousands of words. Any speaker of a human language knows something on that order of words, right? So we're talking about quite an order of magnitude of difference. But more importantly, it looks like these animal language learning experiments, in particular the apes, the great apes, do not show evidence of acquiring a really crucial aspect of human language, which is grammar. There's no organizational principle like connecting the words in a systematic way so that those words, the meaning of the entire sentence derives not just from the meaning of the words in the sentence, but from also how those words are put together. So in English, you can say things like, the orange gave me Nim Chimpsky. And this is completely interpretable. We know what it means. If it may be weird, but okay. It's unclear whether Nim Chimpsky would know how to convey that meaning versus the meaning he was conveying there. That's all I have to say about poor Nim Chimpsky. I have nothing but respect for my ape cousins. I stress. It's just that what these experiments teach me as a linguist is that, okay, it makes it even clearer to me what it is that human languages are doing that seems to be absent, as far as we know, with any other communication system that naturally occurs in the animal kingdom. And then when we take our closest cousins in the animal kingdom and we attempt to train them to use the communication system we have, this block seems to be not with associating particular symbols with particular concepts or things in the world, but rather coming up with a systematic way to combine those in systematic and novel ways, which is what we call grammar, right? So that's what I would say about that.
And tying that all together with a bit of context before my next question, I should explain, Nim Chimpsky was sort of a tongue-in-cheek name that was given to a chimpanzee who was the subject or participant in a study that aimed to disprove the linguist Noam Chomsky's claim that only humans are capable of acquiring language.
Right.
But actually, based on what you've just said and my interpretation of those data, it seems to be a unique feature of humans that hasn't translated. But
I think that's fair to say. I mean, of course, it depends on how you define language. I mean, if you define it as a communication system, broadly speaking, I mean, I think any animal has a communication system. So the question is, insofar as human language is used as a communication system, what properties does it have? I mean, imagine, songbirds put humans in cages and attempted to do experiments on us to see how well we would acquire songbird song. I mean, we would be doing a similar kind of experiment. It's quite obvious that songbirds are equipped to pay attention to certain properties of songbird song and to naturally produce it themselves. And it would be somehow perverse to stick another species in that environment and expect it to behave in the same way. This doesn't mean that chimpanzees are somehow not as good as human beings. It's just that, okay, they are a different kind of animal.
Do you know about Kiki and Booba?
Are they cousins of Nim Chimpsky? No, I don't. I don't know about Kiki and Booba.
Okay, so I want you to imagine, because I don't have anything to illustrate this in front of me.
Okay, eyes are closed.
There are two shapes.
Got it.
One of them is kind of a bit jagged and pointy, like
I know what it is
cartoon.
now. Okay, got it. Wait, but no, continue. Yes, for the sake of the audience, right? So one of the shapes is jagged and pointy. Yeah.
Yeah, you might see bang or pow in a comic book. Right. And the other one is kind of round and less jagged and pointy. Yes. Which is Kiki and which is Booba? I will tell you, the vast majority of respondents to this question will tell you that the jaggedy thing is called Kiki and the round cloud-looking thing is called Booba. So this is a phenomenon known as sometimes called sound symbolism, right? So one of the core assumptions that undergirds a lot of linguistic inquiry is that association between particular sound, combinations of sounds and particular meanings is arbitrary. There's no inherent link between calling something a dog and the creature that word refers to. Right. And we know this because different languages use arbitrarily different strings of sounds to refer to the same things. Okay, what this kind of example shows is an apparent is in tension with that we have a tendency to associate certain sounds with certain categories of stimuli in the world, right? Like sharp, angular things are more readily associated with certain types of sounds. Here, the k sound. Also, that's almost, it might be the E, the vowel is involved there too, but certainly the consonant. The booba would be somehow associated with round things. And then the question is why, right? So the only thing I can tell you is this is not peculiar to English. This type of experiment has been done cross-linguistically, and it's quite general across the world's languages. Another thing I can tell you is that there are subdomains of any given language where this type of sound symbolism is exploited. So the onomatopoeia that a language has is something of this kind, right? Where we use certain kind of sounds. Splash, bang.
Splash, bangs. For some reason, bang would be a lot less good of a representation of a gun going off if the word we used was splash, went the gun. We have an intuition that that's not arbitrary, completely arbitrary. The final thing I'll tell you, this is kind of fun, is there has been recent research in this domain of sound symbolism, spearheaded by, I think sort of got started with a guy who was a sound researcher, for lack of a better, he studies phonetics and phonology, and he was a year above me in grad school. His name's Shigeto Kawahara, and he started a domain of research known as Pokémonastics. So in the world of Pokemon, the Pokemons evolve, correct? Like they level up or something, and when they evolve, their names change. And what it turns out is if you do statistical analysis on the names of the pre-evolved Pokemons and the post-evolved Pokemons, there is a there's a statistically significant non-random element in certain sounds being used for the stronger versions of the Pokemons versus the weaker versions. And this finding has been replicated in other languages. So when Pokemon is translated into into English, for example, they change the names. And so this type of research has gotten the name Pokémonastics. And there is a international conference on Pokémonastics that I believe has been held at least a couple of times at this point. So I'll be sure to send you a link to Pokémonastics, and you can put it on the show notes if anyone would like to follow up on that. So that's all I have to say about sound symbolism, which is what you're just talking about.
Man, we could just go for hours.
Yeah, we could.
Before I let you go,
yes,
we usually like to wrap up with a quick fire round.
Okay.
Can you explain in simple terms what it is that you do?
So as a semanticist, I study how language conveys meaning, but also how people use language to convey meaning. As a Ryukyuanist, or as a person who studies Yaeyaman, I look at the languages of Yaeyama. I record as much of them as I can in a naturalistic setting, and I also try to find out how those languages work systematically.
Which emerging research area in linguistics are you most excited about?
So there is a big boom in machine learning approaches to language, mostly from an engineering perspective. With respect to semantics, which I was just talking about, there has been this approach called vector semantics that's come out of the basically the engineering community. I'm excited about the possibility of combining these sort of data-centric, highly quantitative, atheoretical machine learning-based approaches with more theoretically driven research in the future.
If you could wave a magic wand and erase a common misconception in linguistics from everybody's collective memories, what would that be?
It would be that the variety of language a person uses is indicative of that person's characteristics, such as their intelligence or their level of education. So basically, as we have been talking about, there are different language varieties, different languages have become associated with different types of levels of prestige. And people have become very sensitive recently to things like racial prejudice, gender prejudice, anti-LGBTQ prejudice, and are rather careful about, people that care about these kind of things are careful about how they talk about these groups of people. But it has not permeated the culture just the degree to which linguistic discrimination is equally unfair and damaging. So that's something I would like to see. If I could wave a magic wand and make everyone have an egalitarian view of varieties of speech, that's the effect I'd like to have. Do you have such a wand?
Unfortunately not.
No. So It's not the case, by the way, I should mention, it's not the case that these things are not correlated with various socioeconomic things. They are. But that what it is that people have become woke to the idea that it's not cool to discriminate against people based on their class background per se, that it's not cool to discriminate against people based on their race or ethnicity, etc. per se. Their country of origin per se. But insofar as language becomes a proxy for those things, it becomes an admissible, a socially acceptable way to discriminate against people without directly targeting those aspects of that person's identity that the language variety is actually a proxy for. So I think it's a way to be a racist, to be a bigot without actually being
labeled one.
Being labeled one, yeah. So I think people should be careful about it.
And maybe you and I should go ahead and embrace our Texan and Mancunian roots.
That's right, shall we? Shall we close off with?
I mean, you've got tenure now. You can speak how you want.
I can talk however I damn please.
Do you have a tool that you use in your research that you're particularly fond of using?
Oh yeah, the most recent version of the Zoom recorder, the one that you're using right here. If we're doing field work, a really good recorder with a good unidirectional headset microphone, and optimally, as the new Zoom does, a video camera that's incorporated with the audio recorder so that you get time-aligned video and audio data. Couldn't live without it.
Yeah. It's a shame this episode isn't sponsored by Zoom, but we'll give them that one for free.
Give them that one for free.
Do you have a favorite linguistics joke or fact for us?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I have a kind of an anti-fact. So everyone's favorite linguistic bit of trivia involves the shocking number of words for snow that the indigenous people and the Arctic region around Alaska and so on are supposed to have, yeah. And I'd just like to maybe spoil this bit of false trivia. I'm afraid that that's basically a myth or a hoax. That they do have some words for different types of snow, but it's not like they have hundreds of thousands of words for snow.
Chris, where can people go to find out more about your work?
Well, now that I've been asked, I guess I'll have to update my website. So I have a website that's it's been sleeping for a while, but cmdavis.org is my website. And you can go there. You can see what papers I'm writing and other things.
Chris Davis, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. This is your host, Chris Richardson. Our brand was designed by Lloyd Preston Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. You can find more music from For The Record at soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.